Housing and Community Development. I am glad to have you here today. Thank you for taking the time to be with us to learn more about the Real Property Investment Grant. And now I am going to be sharing my entire screen, and I'm not going to be able to see you all. We're going to do some housekeeping items and talk about how we're going to be answering questions. Please mute yourself and turn off your camera if you would like to. This session is being recorded, and there will be time for questions using the chat feature. So please, if you have a question during the presentation, put your question in the chat, and at the end of the presentation, we will go back through and answer all of your questions. Bear with me, I'm just getting my screen straight. All right. DHCD is committed to creating safe, affordable, and prosperous communities to live, work, and do business in Virginia. The Enterprise Zone program is a part of the Community Revitalization Office, and our vision statement is that we're committed to coaching communities in a way that is resourceful, collaborative, educational, inspirational, and practicable so that they are empowered to take actions that build local capacity. We make our goal to be a part of your team at your local level so that we can help you to build your community and take advantage of our resources as best as possible. The Virginia Enterprise Zone program consists of 45 zones throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. As far west as Zone 52, which is Wise County, and as far east as Zone 26, which is Accomack and Northampton counties. I'd like to start by giving a little snapshot of what the previous grant year looked like through the numbers. We gave out 196 job creation grant and real property investment grants that were awarded. 42 businesses received job creation grants in over 1.9 million in total job creation grant awards. And that included 2,740 jobs that were either created or retained and were applied for and received grants. For the Real Property Investment Grant, we gave grants to over 154 properties. That was over $12.5 million in awards. And those businesses leveraged over $347 million in qualified investments for that grant money. The Enterprise Zone program is a partnership between state and local governments to encourage job creation and private investment in targeted areas throughout the Commonwealth by providing two grant-based incentives, the Job Creation Grant and the Real Property Investment Grant. The program is subject to General Assembly appropriation, and our program is a little different than some other state programs that are grant-based. The jobs must be created and the improvements must be completed before a business or a zone investor may receive the grant money. Job creation grants are funded at 100%, and then the remaining funds are allocated to real property investment grants. And for this reason, the RPIGs are often prorated. Last year in grant year 2020, they were prorated at 88%, and the year before that, they were prorated at 84% or 84 cents on the dollar. And those are pretty low prorations for what we've seen in the past. In the past, they've been more at 75%. Our entire program is based on a calendar year that includes the procedures and documentation necessary for the grants. Submission. One important thing to note this year is that we are no longer accepting hard copies. In the past, we required electronic submission and hard copy submission. Last year, we required online submission, and we were accepting hard copies, but we are no longer accepting hard copies at all. Everything is done online in the Enterprise Zone submission portal. There is a link to this portal right here on the presentation. I'll be sending this presentation out to all of you later in the week. And At the time of submission, all forms and documentation must be submitted by the deadline in order to be considered on time. This year, April 1st falls on a Friday, and that is the date of submission. All submissions must be in by 11:59 p.m. on April 1st, 2022. Let's go over some of the eligibility requirements for the RPIG. The RPIG is available to investors that are undertaking rehab, expansion, or new construction projects within the boundaries of enterprise zones. So that includes both buildings and facilities. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to go over some common errors or frequently asked questions. And one of those is whether a property is considered a building or a facility and how to tell the difference. So in the meantime, a building or facility must be either commercial, industrial, or mixed use. Commercial includes both office and retail spaces. And for our purposes, mixed use has to be at least 30% usable floor space devoted to commercial, office, or industrial use. So for example, if you had a 3-story building and maybe the top 2 floors were apartments, but the bottom floor was commercial, it was either office, retail space, or even restaurant space, then that, if that entire floor is 30% of the entire building, then that would be considered mixed use for our purposes. Eligible applicants. A qualified zone investor is any entity or individual capitalizing on the costs associated with the real property investment. Very often we get questions about, who should apply for this grant? We have a developer, but then we have an owner of the property. We have a tenant and we have a landlord. Who is the person who should apply? The key here to remember is that the person who should apply is the person who's capitalizing on those investment costs. So this can include property owners. The property owner can either be the occupant or a non-occupant property owner. There can be multiple owners. Rights to RPIG qualification should be coordinated with all other owners of the property in this case. And so an example of that may be a condo building. They may be a tenant. Any tenant making leasehold improvements may apply, but they must have the owner's permission, and only if the improvements are being capitalized by the tenant instead of the landlord or owner. And also developers may be zone investors. Rights to RPIG qualification should be reflected in sale documents if property has been sold. We're going to go over these in more detail and which supplemental forms are required for these different applicants. Eligible projects. So as stated before, eligible projects include new construction, rehab or expansion, and then also solar projects. That may be a new construction with solar, rehab or expansion with solar, or a solar only project. Each different type of project requires a different threshold amount that must be met in order to be eligible for a real property investment grant. As you can see on the left, we have of the chart, it has the list of the type of investment, and the second column tells you the threshold amount that must be made. So for a new construction project that is under $5 million total, the amount must be $500,000 for the threshold. So if there's a total investment of $1 million and the threshold of $500,000 is met, then we subtract that, and that means that the total grant eligible funds are $500,000. You may receive up to 20% of that amount up to $100,000. And as I said earlier, sometimes these RPIGs, or most of the time these RPIGs are prorated. And if they're prorated at 88%, then that 88% of the $100,000 would be an $88,000 grant reward. For a rehab or expansion project, the threshold is $100,000. For new construction with solar, the threshold is $450,000. And for rehab or expansion with solar, the threshold is $50,000. And we're going to go over those solar details in a future slide, and it will help them to make sense a little bit more. These are just examples. Qualified investments. Your qualified investments are your hard construction costs that are structurally part of the building or the facility. These include expenditures associated with any exterior, interior, structural, mechanical, or electrical improvements that are necessary to construct, expand, or rehabilitate a building for commercial, industrial, or mixed use. That can include excavations, grading and paving, installing driveways, or landscaping or land improvements. There are some examples here on this list. There is a full list in the RPIG manual that is an exhaustive list with lots of different examples of what an eligible cost is and what an ineligible cost is. Some ineligible costs include acquisition costs for the property, architectural fees, closing costs, furnishings, insurance, signage, any kind of permit fees, things of that nature that are not hard construction costs, that are soft costs, are not eligible for real property investment grants. Calculating awards. The dollar amount of a grant is based on the amount spent on the qualified real property investments. So grant awards are equal to 20% of the QRPI made in excess of the threshold. So that's $100,000 for a rehab or expansion project and $500,000 for a new construction, with grant award caps based on the amount of the investment. Grant awards are capped per building or facility over 5 years, which is a consecutive term. So you may receive up to $100,000 per building or facility for a QRPI of less than $5 million and up to $200,000 for a QRPI of over $5 million for constructions. So with that 5-year consecutive term, that means that if you were to receive a grant in 2020 for qualified real property investments, let's say you were eligible for the full $100,000 grant, but it was prorated at 88%. So you only received $88,000. That means that you still are eligible for the remaining $12,000 in the next 5 years. However, in order to receive that $12,000, you have to meet the threshold again in the year for which you are applying for that next grant. Here's another example of calculations. As you can see here, if you have a rehab project and the investment is $500,000, we subtract the threshold amount of $100,000, which will give you a grant eligible amount of $400,000. At a grant rate of 20%, the grant would be $80,000. And here's another example when that rehab grant money is capped at the total amount that may be received, the maximum amount. If the investment is $2 million and the threshold is $100,000, then the grant eligible amount is $1,900,000. At a grant rate of 20%, the total amount of eligible grant money would be $380,000, which obviously exceeds that maximum grant amount. So you would receive the maximum grant amount of $100,000. Solar eligibility. So in 2019, the General Assembly passed legislation to allow projects with solar components to qualify at lower thresholds than the other type of construction projects. So solar only improvements between $50,000 and $100,000 would qualify with a $0 threshold. There is no threshold amount. Solar as part of a project that is larger lowers the threshold by $50,000. So let's look at an example of that. If it's a solar only project and the investment is $75,000, then your threshold amount is $0 because it's between $50,000 and $100,000 investment. Your grant eligible amount is $75,000, and at a grant rate of 20%, the grant would be $15,000. For a rehab with solar, the investment example is $500,000 with a threshold of $50,000 met for a grant eligible amount of $450,000 at a 20% rate for a grant amount of $90,000. This chart helps to see the investment continuum a little bit. So your minimum investment for rehab or expansion is $100,000. For new construction, it's $500,000. That sweet spot, the amount of investment that's required to maximize that grant out at $100,000 for a rehab and expansion is $600,000. And that's because if you take the $600,000, you subtract that minimum investment, you have $500,000 grant eligible amount You can receive up to 20%, which is $100,000 and the maximum amount. And similar process is done for the new construction. So you can see here that the upper threshold for rehab and expansion, you would be eligible for additional $100,000 grant if, excuse me, I didn't mean to click forward, if the investment is $5 million for a rehab and expansion. And the same goes for a new construction. The application process. So one of the most important things to remember for the Real Property Investment Grant is that in order to be eligible for this upcoming year, which we call grant year 2021, a property must have been placed in service between January 1st of 2021 and December 31st of 2021. So anytime in calendar year 2021. A copy of the placed in service documentation must be submitted with those applications. So that placed in service documentation can be one of three different things. If a permit was required by the locality, then that placed in service documentation is either going to be a certificate of occupancy or a final building inspection from the locality. And which one of those it is dependent on the locality. If no permits were required for that investment and for that project, then a final third-party inspection may be utilized. But all of those have to have the date between January 1st and December 31st of 2021 to be eligible for this upcoming grant year. All of the online forms are on our submission site, which you will have in this PowerPoint. And it's important to remember, for those of you who may be local zone administrators, that applications are not completed through our other program that we often use called CAMS. Important documents that you will find in required materials include the Form Easy RPIG, which we're going to go over next, supplemental forms for different situations, which we will also go over. You will scan and upload your placed in service documentation. You will also scan and upload your Commonwealth of Virginia W-9. Sometimes people submit their federal tax form instead. We cannot accept that. We must have that Commonwealth of Virginia W-9 in order to have the appropriate documentation to give you your check for your grant money. And then also the CPA attestation report must be scanned in and submitted online. All of this must be submitted together with the application in order to be considered on time. Form Easy RPIG. There are 7 parts of this form, and we are going to go over each of them now. The first is your background information. This is the information that you fill in to tell you about the project, to tell us about the project, what type it is, the property use, whether it's a building or facility, what type of investment was made. The property identification number and number 8, that is the property identification number that is used in the locality for which the property is in. So for a lot of those are tax ID numbers for that property. Different localities do that a little bit differently. Your zone name, you can find that by contacting the local zone administrator, which you're going to have to do anyways in order to have this document signed. And the zone administrator will sign this document verifying a number of things, and they will also sign a local zone administrator verification document as well. Online, you will fill out the exact same information that's on here. So you're going to upload this document, but there's a place online that you'll fill out that information as well. And online, there's a number 14 that we've added. It is a narrative summary about your project. This is where you can provide a summary paragraph explaining the building and the use and the building owner, a summary of the work that's completed, and any other helpful background information on the project. So if you're talking to someone who doesn't know anything about the project, what would you want them to know? That's where you would put that there. And that will help us get a better idea of your project and help us to make sure that you have all the appropriate documentation when we're reviewing your grant. The next part is the placed in service documentation. You're going to check in part A what type of placed in service documentation you are submitting. You also are going to explain any differences in the name and address listed on the placed in service document from the name and address listed on the form. So this is a copy of an old form because it says calendar year 2019, but the form this year looks the same with just a different calendar year. And a lot of times the Part B is not necessary unless that name is different for whatever reason. And sometimes that has to do with the owner of the property and the person who is applying for the grant being different. Part 3 is your itemized list of your qualified real property investments. You're going to list on the left side the investment. Be as specific as possible. One of the common errors that we see is a lack of specificity. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that correctly, but please be specific on that left column so that we know that it's a qualified investment, because if you're not specific, we're going to have to come back to you and ask you. It's going to draw out the process and could affect whether or not you receive money for that part of your qualified investment list. You will write the dollar amount here and then the total amount here. Online, we also have an Excel sheet. This is new. The Excel sheet is just to make things easier for both you and for us when we are reviewing your grant. On the left, you do the description of the investment and be specific once again. On the right column, you put the cost. And then over here is where it will have a formula that you cannot change that will add up all of those costs together to give us one cost, total cost for your qualified investments. Part 4 is qualification information. You're going to write when that property was placed in service, the qualification year, the dollar amount of qualified real property investments. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee really quick since I'm getting so tongue-tied. Excuse me. Applicable investment threshold based on the investment, and then the amount of public grant funds received for the investment. That's important because any public grant funds, whether they are federal, state, or local grant monies, cannot be used as real property investment. So if something was paid for by grant monies, they cannot be included in your investment calculations. And down here is where you're going to put whether you have received grants in the last 5 years so that we'll know that you're not receiving over the total amount that you're allowed to receive in that 5-year cycle. The next spot on the application online is for you to upload documents. Please ensure that the documents are not password protected, and they must all be uploaded separately. Last year we had a lot of instances in which one PDF was submitted with all of the documents in one, as if it was one document. We have to have all of those separately for our records. So here you're going to submit the applicant declaration form. That is a form that says that you are attesting that everything is factual information and correct in what you're submitting. You're going to submit a scanned version of your placed in service documentation, the CPA attestation report form. That is the form that the CPS fills out for you. It is very detailed. They go over everything to make sure that you're submitting everything that you need. And we actually had our first ever CPA training at the beginning of the week. It was well received and was a great way for the CPAs to get more comfortable with the CPA process for this grant. You're also going to submit your itemized list, which is that Excel spreadsheet. You will submit your Commonwealth of Virginia W-9, your LZA review documentation. LZA is local zone administrator. That's the document that they review to make sure that everything is correct. You will submit that Form Easy RPIG, and then you will also submit these forms that are supplemental if applicable to your situation, which we will go over in the next slides. Supplemental forms. Supplemental forms are required if investments were made to a mixed-use building. If so, then you will fill out Form Easy RPIG Mixed Use. If the zone investor is a tenant, you will either fill out the tenant owner consent form. That is the owner giving the tenant permission to apply for the grant, or the Easy RPIG tenant coordination form. If the zone investor owns a space within a building or facility, which is usually in the situation of a condo, then you will fill out Form Easy RPIG multiple owner. Mixed use buildings. So Form Easy RPIG mixed use verifies that at least 30% of usable square footage in the building is devoted to commercial, office, or industrial use. If there are common areas that are accessible to the commercial space, then that common area may be counted toward the commercial square footage. So you may have a lounge or a conference room or even a kitchen. If that's accessible to the commercial space, then that may be included in the footage. Form Easy RPIG mixed use must be completed by the preparer of the measured drawings or plans for work done to the reference building. So the preparer of plans must be a licensed third-party architect, surveyor, or draftsperson. The CPA will review the status of the license during the attestation process to make sure that that person's license is up to date and that they qualify. Grant coordination. Supplemental forms for tenant coordination and multiple owners ensure that no more than the applicable grant cap is requested within a 5-year period for the building or facility. In cases where owners and tenants do not coordinate, DHCD will determine the maximum grant amount available based on the cumulative amount of real property investment made to the property or proportion of square footage leased or owned by the zone investor. And there is a whole section in our manual about proration and what that looks like. You don't want us to prorate it, so make sure that you're filling out the necessary supplemental forms for your grant application. Let's go over some common errors that are also some frequently asked questions for the RPIG. Placed in service documentation is not final or indicates that pending work or a failed inspection. The zone investor must apply for the grant year associated with the calendar year of their final documentation. So last year we saw some instances in which zone investors submitted final inspections from the locality. And after we followed up with the locality to ensure that the final inspection was the final document necessary, we found out that actually some of those final inspections required a certificate of occupancy after the final inspection. So it is important that you ensure that you do have the final document and that that CO is not pending, because if it is, then it's probably too late for you to have it for this year and to apply for this year's grant, and you will have to get it and apply for the next year of grant dollars. If the placed in service documentation for consecutive phases of a project were received in a different calendar year. So let's go over an example. If a zone investor completed a roof renovation and they got their final certificate of occupancy this past year in 2021, then the zone investor may submit for phases of work on a single application. So let's say they started the roof renovation in 2020, but they got their CO in 2021, then they would apply for the 2021 grant year because that's when they got the final CO. However, if the CO for the roof was issued in January of this year, it would require a separate application for grant year 2023. And let's also say that maybe they decided to do an interior renovation after doing that roof work. And let's say that their interior renovation was completed and a CO was issued this year as well, then it would require a separate application for grant year 2023, which would need to meet that threshold independently of the previous roof investment. Application spans multiple addresses. This happens a lot in terms of a facility, but the CO only references one address. So zone investors can apply for work covered under the placed in service documentation. If that work is covered and covers multiple addresses, then multiple COs should be presented, or that CO should have all of the addresses listed on it. and this should be noted on Form Easy RPIG. In that space of Part B, Part 2 of Form Easy RPIG is your placed in service. Part A is where you check what type of placed in service document, and Part B is where you can list this information. Differences in address entered from one year to another. If you are a zone investor who has applied and received grant funds in the past, then make sure that the physical address is exactly the same as in previous applications. And that's really important when you're using a term like North Street. Make sure that you list it exactly how you did in the past, whether you spelled out North, you listed in, whether you did street or the abbreviation for street. And if you're not sure, or you don't remember how you listed it in the past, just contact me and I'll look it up and give you that information. Properties improperly identified as buildings instead of a facility. Grants are capped per building or facility. The property must be correctly identified so that applicable grant caps are not exceeded. Contact us if you're not sure if it's a building or facility. And in 2 slides from now, I'm going to go over building versus facility and kind of how to tell the difference. Vague or conditional items listed on the schedule of investments. It's best to break down and individually list all investments. So instead of writing site work as your investment, include specific items. What was included in that site work? Excavation, concrete, general conditions. A lack of detail when including conditional items. So a list of conditional items can be found on page 12 of the manual. I'm sorry that should say 2021 and not 2019. So a good example is don't list change orders and instead list additional flooring work. Building versus facility. So a building is what we consider a freestanding and unrelated in function. They may have common ownership of real estate, but leased to tenants and owners, and the tenant may have no say in the general management. And all of those tenants act independently of one another. So a good example of this would be shopping areas that include superstores like Walmart or Target or Lowe's, or a group of adjacent downtown buildings with one owner and multiple tenants. So a clustered complex of buildings that are individual units in the building that are owned separately and operated separately, but choose to co-locate for convenience or by coincidence are considered buildings. So for a facility, we're looking at a complex of buildings co-located at a single physical location. It's not necessarily the same address or parcel, and all of those may be necessary to facilitate or conduct the same trade or business. They must have common ownership and management and operations, not just one of those, all 3 of those. So common management and operations means that the group of buildings is designed to function as a unit, which requires unified operations for tenants. Management company indicates hours of operation, promotions, etc. So an example of this would be malls and shopping centers, a lumber mill plant in which you have, a facility with a building that has your offices, and then another building that's actually your mill, another building for processing. Clustered buildings that share operations, amenities, and employees are considered facilities. So when I'm looking and thinking about whether a property is a building or facility, I'm going to look at whether the buildings are freestanding and unrelated in function. If they are, then they are a building and not a facility. If they are not, then we're going to go on to question number 2. Are the buildings under common ownership? If not, then they are not a facility. If so, we're going to move on to question number 3. If they are under common ownership, are they also under common management and operations? So does the owner dictate hours of operation and promotions? If not, then they are a building. If so, we'll move forward to number 4. If the buildings are related in function, under common ownership, and common management and operations, then they are considered a facility. And yes, this is tricky. If you just simply aren't sure, then that's what I'm here for. You can call, you can send me an email, and we will go over all of the details together and figure out your specific situation together. And that's best to do ahead of time before applying for the grant so that the grant process is as smooth as possible. I've gone over a lot of information. I know that there may be a lot of questions, and I am here to answer them for you. Rebecca, do you mind facilitating the questions?
Absolutely happy to help with that. The only question that we have had so far is about where to find the blank copy of the Commonwealth of Virginia W-9, and we did provide a couple of links to that. Do we have any other questions? Folks, go ahead and type those in the chat box. But it also could be, Kate, that you were so thorough that everyone is good. We'll give folks a second to add some things to the agenda. Okay, we do have a hand raised. Ayeb, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, feel free to ask your question. Or if you aren't able to unmute yourself, again, go ahead and type that question in the chat box. What is the contact phone number for Kate? Do you have a contact slide here, Kate? Wait, she just dropped that in the chat box for you.
And I do have a contact slide that I can switch to as well. But the best number to reach me is the number that's in the chat box. Also, if you need to know who your local zone administrator is, that is on our website and you can find it there.
And I can go ahead and drop that in the chat box as well.
Are there any other questions?
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions coming through. Again, if anyone has questions, feel free to type those in or raise your hand. Ayeb Bassett, again, you do have your hand raised. If you wanted to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, we're waiting on your question, no problem. We're here for you. We're here until 11:30. The slides will be available on the website, as will a recording of the presentation.
I see the question about whether the manuals are final. They do note that they are drafts. That's because we edited them this year, and part of the process is having them up on the town hall website for a number of days. I believe it's 30, it might be longer than that. But once they are up there, then they will be finalized.
So we aren't anticipating any changes to those, but until that process is complete, it will say draft.
Julie, the forms that you need are actually on the Easy portal site, and I will drop that into the chat right now. The manuals are also on that portal site. For those of you that have to go, thank you so much for attending. We'll hold on for this last question.
And to Joy Cipriano's point, absolutely, we're happy to take questions later after you do some homework. That is what we are here for.
I see your question. So if you did a construction project in 2021 and the inspection is due January 2022, you would apply for next year. You cannot apply for this April 1st, 2022 deadline. You would apply in April 1st, 2023. So any projects that received their final placed in service documentation this year in 2022 would apply for next year in 2023. You're welcome. All right, if there are no other questions, thank you all for being here today, and feel free to contact me for any other information.